This is Kate at the Library of Whispers. Now, I have been looking through some of my old history magazines, and I have 5 articles that I thought I would be interested in reading to you, and that you might be interested in listening to. So, this was the first one. It is the Tudors. Which monarch mattered most? So I thought this one would be an interesting article to read. And then we have the scaffold, fiction, film and TV feeds on it. Bluff and genial Henry VIII could be, but Thomas More was right to say that the king would have no qualms in cutting his head off if it would win him a castle in France. Fascination about Elizabeth ignores an England where a woman in labour might be dragged into another parish to avoid her pauper brat becoming a charge on the rates. Romance is today's celebrity cult in costume. The excuse is offered, it's drama, not history, but why then spend thousands on historically accurate costume and scenery? Shakespeare didn't. A better reason for the fascination is that Tudor England has a high density of memorable people, not least its monarchs. However, this was no flowering of the English spirit. Quite simply, we know more. We visit Tudor houses. Portraits show what Tudor people were like. More than that, the image they wanted to present. Holbein airbrushes his sitters. Most important of all, personal papers and modern public records first survive in quantity. Letters, accounts, memoranda, narratives, evidence of all sorts multiplies. The Paston letters are famous because similar 15th century collections are few, not so in the 16th. The new sources do not simply provide personalia, such as Henry VII's susceptibility to dancing girls. They let us see the Tudors in a fresh way, new questions, who did this and why, new understandings of business, society, law and order, new areas of study, gender, family, folk belief. For earlier centuries, such knowledge is hard won. As the 16th progresses, the problem can be too much data. to recede in England, and the population increased. In other words, the Tudors arrived with, or were soon followed by, an economic boom, another example of the phenomenal look everywhere except in the bedroom. Particularly from the 1540s, the expanding labour force made sustained growth possible. Consumer goods such as stockings, pots and pans, new or enlarged industries, mining, glass and paper making, the new draperies, luxury trades including theatre, and all was underpinned by political stability. Religious changes did not lead to civil war. Mary Tudor's was the only successful rebellion, otherwise the elite stayed loyal. As always, there was a downside, a vicious downside. Harrison noted higher rents, the pressures of a money economy, and less concern for the poor. The increase in population meant that prices rose, and this was made worse by currency manipulation. The gap between the comfortable and the poor widened significantly. A village economy had always needed resident poor to provide seasonal labour. Now, structural unemployment became endemic. The 1590s were horrendous as the cost of the war fed inflation. Suffering was made infinitely worse by bad harvests. In some years, paupers died in the streets. Nevertheless, the England of 1600 was enormously wealthier than in 1500. An insular agricultural country was becoming a country with a growing trade and industry sector. New families, Russells, Spencers, Cecils, Cavendishes, were forging ahead to lead the country and would do so until the 20th century. Tudor England was exciting to live in, and that makes it exciting to study, warts and all. Okay, so that's the introduction. So now we're going to look at Henry VII, 1485 to 1509, the survivor and stabilizer. Now this is a portrait of Henry VII in 1505. His claim to the throne was tenuous and he had to see off a posse of pretenders, yet he proved a canny and competent ruler, modernising the justice system and lifting the crown's coffers. Okay, so he may not win many popularity contests, but, says Stephen Gunn, Henry VII set the blueprint for a dynasty that was to make England a global power. Henry VII is the inscrutable Tudor, less charismatic than Henry VIII or Elizabeth, less tragic than Edward or Mary. He stands no realistic chance in a most famous Tudor competition, but that is no reason to forget him. We should admire Henry first for his tenacity. When he was propelled from exile to the English throne in 1485 by the sudden death of Edward IV, Richard III's seizure of the crown and the bloody Battle of Bosworth, 6 of the last 9 English kings had been deposed, and the average was getting worse. Each of the last 4 had lost the crown, one of them, the hapless Henry VI, twice. 1/4 French, 1/4 Welsh, 1/4 descended from John of Gaunt by his mistress. Henry's claim to the throne of England was hardly compelling, yet he defeated pretender after pretender. Lambert Simnel, Perkin Warbeck, Edmund de 20th century. Henry was not just a survivor, but a stabiliser. He was less trusting, less generous, and less relaxed than many of his subjects might have liked. He is only recorded as laughing in public once. He put more faith in those he had seen tested in the crises of 1483–89 than in young noblemen who thought they ought to govern because of their titles and blood. He took more advice than previous kings from lawyers and financial administrators, men who told him what the crown's powers were and how he might use them to tighten his grip on the kingdom. He used fines for disobedience or for offences against his rights as a means of political control. His richer subjects did not like it, but losing your money to Henry VII was better than losing your head to Henry VIII. He strengthened the crown both financially and in its ability to do justice. Wealth could not guarantee the safety of an incompetent king, but it could make domestic and international politics easier to navigate for a competent one. Henry expanded the crown's lands, drove up the customs by encouraging trade and attacking smuggling, and began to reform the taxes voted by Parliament in time of war, tapping economic growth without retarding it in a way many governments might envy. The demands of the royal conscience and those of troubled subjects combined to make justice a key to good kingship. Henry offered his people faster and more effective decisions in their lawsuits at the centre, through the expanding judicial activity of the King's Council, which would develop into the Courts of Star Chamber and Requests. He did the same in regions far from Westminster, with revivified councils to oversee Wales and the north. In the countries, justices of the peace were more numerous and better supervised. In small towns and villages, the urge for stability coming up from below, stirred by patchy population growth, industrial development, and the mobile, restless youth that came with them, met the determination to enforce order coming down from the king and his councillors. Henry's achievements may not be as spectacular as those of his son and grandchildren, but he laid the foundations for every aspect of later Tudor rule. The calculated magnificence of Richmond Palace and his chapel at Westminster paved the way for Hampton Court and none such. He spread everywhere the family badges that would brand English kingship for the next century and survive to mark coins, tourist board signs and parliamentary buildings to the present day. His patronage both of church reformers like Bishop John Fisher and the Franciscan observants, and of lawyers who attacked the church's jurisdiction and skimmed off its wealth, foreshadowed the mix of piety and power play in the coming Reformation. His use of Parliament to address problems in government and society prepared it for its role in the bigger changes ahead. His low-born but talented ministers, Reynold Bray, measures had immense consequences. A society with men and women who, at least in principle, turn their face from the world and devote themselves exclusively to the worship of God is qualitatively different from one which has no monks and nuns. Henry was also much involved in the codification of what Christians should believe. Although he had broken from Rome, dissolved monasteries and effectively abolished pilgrimage, he rejected the Lutheran doctrine of justification by faith alone and remained devoted to the Mass. Henry also authorised the publication and the reading in church of the Bible in English translation, a measure which over time has had immense consequences. Henry's was thus a remarkably hybrid church. Probably very few agreed fully with the king. Most would have preferred to remain Catholic, while a minority wholeheartedly accepted the change but wanted much more far-reaching reform. In many ways, Henry's influence proved decisive when it fell to Queen Elizabeth to determine the church of her realm. True, the liturgy would now be in English, but the ambiguities and ambivalences of liturgy and doctrine were not unlike those of the church of Henry's later years, just when Elizabeth was growing up. A Church of England that is uniquely no longer Catholic, but not Protestant in any full sense, is very much Henry's legacy. Henry was also a warrior king. In 1513, 1523, and in the mid-1540s, he launched invasions of France and continued to claim that he was rightfully king of France. Bold in ambition, cautious in practice, he was prepared to spend a fortune, not least the windfall of the dissolved monasteries' lands, on military campaigns which achieved little, both in France and in Scotland, and he left an appalling financial legacy to those who ruled the realm of the minority of his son, Edward. Henry was a passionate builder. Few monarchs have invested so much in grand palaces and hunting lodges. The Hall of Hampton Court, which he largely rebuilt in the early 1530s, testifies to his ambitions, and his extraordinary collection did not merely leave its mark on contemporary architecture. The design of none such palace in which Henry was closely involved had a huge influence on the great prodigy houses of Elizabethan England, and is reflected in the eclectic styles of Woollerton, Hardwicke and Kirby Halls. Henry was also much interested in painting and attracted to England Hans Holbein, one of the greatest artists of the age. Holbein's image of Henry VIII has had an immense impact. No English king is more recognisable. And then there are Henry's 6 wives, a real-life soap opera that writers of fiction would be hard-pressed to surpass. First, Catherine of Aragon, loyal to the end, but repudiated by Henry after he had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. Secondly, Anne, who 3 years after her marriage to Henry would be executed for treasonably committing adultery. Thirdly, Jane Seymour, dying soon after giving birth to Edward. Next, Anne of Cleves, a marriage arranged for diplomacy facing opposition